All right. Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to see you here. We'll go ahead and get started in just a moment, but we're delighted that you can join us for Art in Dialogue, Opening Creative Spaces of Encounter, Self, Other, and the Arts. Thanks so much for carving out some time to be with us in Zoom on this beautiful evening here in Eastern Pennsylvania. So hope that you are having nice weather wherever you're located. Right, so we can probably go ahead and start. I think so. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here, and thanks again for carving out some time to join us. I'm William Crowe. I am the director of Lehigh University Art Galleries and professor of practice in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design. And we're delighted that you've carved out some time to join us for this Art in Dialogue series. And Art in Dialogue is really a series of informal conversations about different interdisciplinary topics that connect with great works of art or the arts broadly. And so we'll be having a conversation this evening and hope that you will chime in and participate as well. And our topic tonight, opening creative spaces of encounter, is one that we'll be exploring. If you're like me, you've probably been thinking a lot about space over the past year. I think my first official act when the pandemic began was to clean out my closet and read Marie Kondo, The Art of Tidying Up. We've been thinking a lot about digital spaces. Where are we? What are we doing? And then also, how do we return to different kinds of spaces? Museums clearly are places that are invested in creating spaces between people, between works of art and people, as are universities and educational spaces. But we'll talk a little bit tonight about what are creative spaces of encounter. How can they support diverse ways of being, seeing, expressing, and creating? And maybe what could we learn from artists or architects or others to create these spaces? So just a little bit about the Lehigh University Art Galleries before we begin our conversation. If you're not familiar, we have over 17,000 works of art from diverse time periods and cultures at LUAG. And our mission is to advance critical thinking, cultural understanding, and well-being for campus and community through transformative experiences with art. We have 2 art study centers, a reading room, over 50 outdoor sculptures, and even outdoor exhibitions like the one that's on the South Bethlehem Greenway right now. And I'd love to introduce our 2 speakers tonight. We have Dr. Angelina Rodriguez, who is the director of the Global Citizenship program and professor of practice in the College of Education. And she oversees the Center for Global Citizenship through the Arts. And I'm so fascinated by her research and her practices that really aim to study issues of difference and dialogue and how we can bring diverse people, diverse perspectives together, and also learn from the arts in terms of how we might do that. I have Brent's title slide a little bit further on, I think, in our presentation, but I'm also delighted to introduce Brent Stringfellow, who is Assistant Vice President, Associate Vice President for facilities, but also University Architect. And Brent oversees, actually, I can't even count the number of projects that are happening at Lehigh, but everything from residential living spaces to academic facilities to everything in between. And he has taught at a number of universities and brings all kinds of expertise to this dialogue. And so with that, maybe I'll just kind of open up the conversation with our kind of a foundational question, which is what are creative spaces of encounter, or how might we define that? And so maybe, Lena, if you don't mind, maybe sharing a little bit about your thoughts on that topic. And I'm happy to be the driver of our slides here too, so I can pull those up at any moment.
All right. Thanks so much, William, and thanks for inviting me to come and have this fun conversation with you and Brent. I appreciate it. I think creative spaces our encounter are really looking at how art spaces, whether a museum, whether a performance, whether a piece of art itself, just how we move into these particular places and how people can come together to engage across these spaces as well while they're in the looking or in the watching or in the absorbing whatever the is happening in the space. So I see a creative space as one in which not only can we perhaps work through our issues, and you see a lot of sublimation through the arts and working through passion and violence and love and everything else, but also what happens when we're there and what sort of opens up in our own identities, sort of how we release some of our usual borders and what can get transgressed as we're in these spaces of all kinds of sensory stimuli with other people who we know or don't know. And just I like looking at what the potential there is, again, to sort of undo something and maybe build something new.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's fascinating because, maybe it's been a while since we've been doing this physically, but universities and museums and other types of creative spaces, like they're places that can really bring people together into social experiences and places where people can share really diverse viewpoints, and sometimes those can be really challenging conversations where they're interrogating a lot of really important issues that are relevant to our time. So I think this is really a very timely topic for us to be thinking about. Super. And I know you have a number of images too that I'm fascinated by, and I don't want to delve us into something that you're not ready to speak about. But sometimes these are spaces that artists create, or they might also be spaces, as daily as a marketplace. And so I'm curious if you might speak a little bit about that, or feel free to direct me if there's any examples you'd like to share.
Yeah, if you want to show the examples, I'm happy to do that. So what I have are 3 examples from prior research. This is the city in which I used to live and work. The first one is really about where people are in space. So there's this beautiful city up in the corner, it's called Guanajuato in the middle of Mexico, that's known for its bright colors and for its just sheer loveliness. But then at the periphery of the city, you have spaces that look like the one on the other side where the bright colors don't go and where some of the beauty does not necessarily lead. So in the next slide, if you can pass that, I was looking at a group that lived up in one of these peripheral spaces at a project that was happening there to bring the beauty of the downtown up to these very marginalized spaces. So there was an effort to bring up the colorful paint to paint the buildings. And then there was the project also at the same time was working with kids and this gentleman who's actually the leader of a gang called the Pollos Negros, which is the not so intimidating, the black chickens, but a legitimate gang and not to be trifled with. But the project was working through his influence and his community and some of his children as well, as long as with others, and to allow for the kids to create their own art, not only to beautify their space, but then to bring their art down to the University Museum in the middle of the pretty area where the nice people go and so on. So there was this re-choreographing of who was where and where the beauty was. And so to bring these spaces together and bring some of us from the university up and then the children down to the museum, we started to take apart the usual routes that people take through this space. So that was one of the examples. I don't know if you want me to show the other 2 at once or go to Brent or.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
It's so fascinating to think about too, these, the spaces and how also, people, it changes our behaviors in different ways. Like when you're mentioning this gentleman that you worked with, and, we think about participation in a gang as something not very desirable, but how, being a part of this beautification project and this art project can really engage people in different ways. I think about a great art educator and museum educator, Elliot Eisner, who passed away several years ago, and he talked about the silent pedagogies of spaces. And so whether it's a neighborhood like you're showing us, or a market, or a museum, or a classroom, what are the different silent pedagogies that are at work that might be influencing us?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful quote. And that's very apt for what's happening, because people are learning about their place in the space and what they are entitled to and what they can create. And there was an attempt to maybe unsilence some of that and bring out something much, much newer. This slide, these are scenes from the main market, just an average weekday morning where people are reading the newspaper, buying their vegetables, having a juice or something. And then this is happening during Guanajuato's main arts festival every year, which is the Cervantino Festival of the Arts, which is internationally known and on the map, and it's a huge deal. So it happens in the city, but also in very specific spaces. So the main market is not that far from the downtown. It's a tiny city, but these are people that never go to the events, that do not see the music, that do not go to the theater, and so on. There's a very strong line, invisible but drawn. So if you go to the next slide, one year there was then an attempt to bring the opera to the market. So on this average, let's say Tuesday morning, where you're just sitting and having a taco and watching things get started in the day, there was a production then of The Barber of Seville that just popped up in the middle of the market, and everybody just in between the blenders blending and the norteña music going, people just stopped in awe to watch this incredible performance. And at one point, a little girl stood up on one of the stands and started pretending to conduct. And all of the people who probably hadn't heard opera or would never go to an opera suddenly were pulled into this. And it was, the performers later said that it just brought tears to their eyes, because they'd never felt this sort of affect kind of circulating in the air in the same way, with all the smells and the sounds. I mean, just this cacophony around the opera. But again, it completely changed who was able to participate, and desegregated these spaces of everyday life and sort of fancy artistic world of those who couldn't afford to go. So again, a complete shift.
I love how you're describing how the opera was intermingled with the blenders going on in the market and the music from radios. And yeah, like I think art certainly does not have to be confined to these rarefied spaces of an opera hall or a museum. And sometimes it really calls into question, like, are the institutions that we've created, like whether it's the physical walls of a museum or an opera house, are they helping us do what we want to do or not? And I don't know, I wonder, maybe in a post-pandemic world with so many initiatives, like New York pops up where there's performers on the streets doing performances similar to this, I wonder, like, maybe going forward, we'll have more of these opportunities.
Probably, as we've moved into different uses of space this year.
Absolutely.
And the last of these three, then another similar sort of experience. There was an exhibit that was brought from Mexico City that was sponsored by the Jumex Foundation, the big juice maker conglomeration, on hyper-urbanity, with all of these sorts of photos from around the world. The first one is from Mexico, but from everywhere, about just the sort of all the ills of urbanity, the blocks, the lack of any sensory detail, the anonymity of it. And they showed that in the heart of the city, again, in the University Gallery, in a city that has no right angle anywhere in its existence. So the picture here on the bottom left is like a classic, 45-degree angle end of a home with wires everywhere. And it's the topography makes rhyme and reason impossible as it is. And it's very Baroque and the Churrigueresque style, which is just any surface you can add another detail to, add some more detail. So the polar opposite of the slick, flat, hyper urban, super modern everything. And again, it gave people a chance to go and think about their urbanity in the middle of this provincial, very Catholic, very traditional city that builds its own self-image around this sort of bucolic, beautiful, everything that this urbanity slice is not.
Mhm.
So people, again, moved into this weird space, and it was just a very odd shift of what was happening on both sides of the door of the museum, inside and out. And so again, we just see that art is giving the city a chance to rethink who it is and how it wants to live out its own urban nature, and give everybody all of these examples, sort of how we want to conduct our spatial relations with all of these, with music that's other, with people that are other, with architecture that's other, just how we find places to do this in not not a hard clashing way. So in these peaceful, open ways, and how everybody can kind of loosen up those boundaries.
Yeah. No, it really shines a spotlight on, there's so much around us every day, the poetry of the everyday, but often what we need to call our attention to it. Like we need to pause and look closely. And maybe over this past year during the pandemic, maybe we've all had an opportunity to look more closely at our surroundings, whether we're living in a beautiful city of these diverse textures and materials, or just in our own apartments or rooms. Absolutely. So fascinating.
And then this one is a complete swerve. For the last couple of years, I've been working on a book about Bracha Edinger, who is an Israeli artist, pictured here. And she has a lot of very complex psychoanalytical theory, which I won't get into, but about art as an encounter. And you can get a little sense of this looking at this one image. She pulls a bit from Rothko in that sense, where you really have a full-bodied encounter with a piece of art and enter into it. And she is all about, again, loosening your borders and having sort of a spiritual experience within a piece of art. This one is actually made from different scans and copies on top of an image of women who were being marched to their death during the Holocaust at Auschwitz, where she lost a lot of her relatives. She was first generation born in Israel from a family that escaped this. So she's working through her own trauma, but inviting everyone in to also work through theirs and thinking about these threads that connect us in different ways. And this then grafts onto her own trauma that she lived. She was in the 6-Day War as part of her service, and single-handedly at the age of 19 led a rescue mission, ended up with serious trauma and stress after that, and forgot a lot of the details for 50 years. She only recently in the past couple years has remembered a lot of this. But she gets us to engage our past, and she's all about how we can relate to things we didn't live through, how I might relate to your trauma and carry a little bit of that for you, and you might carry a little bit of that for me. And art as sort of opening that invitation for all of us to go in and make some of these threads and connections possible.
So interesting. I'm not as familiar with this artist, so it's really fascinating to hear about it. And certainly, it makes me think about, sometimes we think, oh, we've had a shared experience in a particular space, but then, sometimes when you dig into the surface of that, you wonder, like, well, is that even possible? Like, are any of us having shared experiences? What does that mean? Even in a moment like the pandemic, we've all been experiencing such a range of things in different ways. And so as we think about bringing people together physically, virtually, I think this is a question that people will continue to explore.
Yeah,
wow.
very much. And then this last one, which should link well to Brent's side of images as well. This is a project that one of my students, Jamie Gasai, who's a senior and in the Global Citizenship program, she just created. This is a still from a video with her dance group Tumbao, which is a Latin Caribbean dance group that she was one of the co-founders of at Lehigh. And this is a performance of Afro-Latin dance that made up their final performance for this year. And all of the shots in the video come from these iconic outdoor spaces on Lehigh campus. Thanks to COVID, everything was outside. And she has a lovely video as well about this, talking about what a cathartic tool dance was this year. of COVID, of enclosure, of racial strife, and so on, and how dance really was a place for everyone to re-find some joy and some hope. And I've just put it very suggestively next to this piece by Jeanette Ehlers, who's Danish Trinidadian, and created an amazing video where she has this barely visible shadow or outline of a woman doing a voodoo dance in practice in the Prime Minister's White House in Denmark, to allude to this forgotten racial history upon which all of the wealth was built. So in thinking about bringing different bodies into spaces where they may not be seen, thinking about the origins of the Tumbao dance group and just what it means to bring the Afro-Latin Caribbean sort of squarely into campus, just sort of opening that up suggestively as we look at campus space to see what might be there as well, maybe a future project.
Super, absolutely. And that is a perfect transition to Brent, Associate Vice President and University Architect. And, certainly space is something Brent thinks about all the time, in addition to a million other things related to spaces. So maybe Brent, I'll turn the microphone over to you to maybe share some of your thoughts or connections to things that Lena has mentioned.
Yeah, thanks, William, and thanks, Lena. It's really fascinating, and I think, the idea of spaces of encounter. I mean, to me, obviously, I'm biased in terms of looking at things through an architectural lens, but I think the arts, as they inhabit architecture or expand architecture, become very critical to what that space of encounter can be. And I threw a couple of slides in, and William, if you want to kind of just advance through. So, I mean, what it gets, it always begs the thought, and William touched on this in terms of the question of the vessels, the architectural vessels that we have created for culture historically, particularly in Western art and architecture. There is a question of, that's a very specific type of art experience. And I mean, to slightly oversimplify, I associate words like formal, personal. You're building spaces that are very much about the experience between the occupant of a space, the viewer of a piece of art, and that piece of art. And these are all staged in a very specific way, the kind of conventions of the gallery, the conventions of the museum. And they're very somewhat formal, and expected is probably one of the words I think about in these types of settings. The other aspect of it is, if you want to advance to the next one, is the fact that so many of these objects are not necessarily works that were even created for those spaces, but are taken out of context, sometimes in more nefarious ways than others, in terms of some of the colonial objects that reside in our museums. And it has an interesting, there's two sides of that coin. When you look at something, you think in one way, wow, I'm able to experience this and see an object that I wouldn't necessarily be able to go to the space where it existed. But at the same time, you realize that some of these may have been sapped of what their original power was, their context or understanding, how they might have been used, much as history or time sometimes removes that ability to understand how it was used, removing it from context and placing it, taking an object of thousands of years old of age and putting it into a ultra modern space, obviously changes its meaning. Look at the next one. And I think within this context, this is one of my favorite pieces. William will know this. Karen Olivier, who's a visiting artist a couple years ago at LUAG, and did this amazing project where, in my mind, this is where using a gallery and starting to take those spaces and use art to challenge expectations and challenge your experience and actually expand what you're seeing beyond the boundaries of the gallery. And this is essentially an Audi that was constructed out of old materials and shoes that have been held together with a car cover. So it was this personification of what a car might be, but it was made out of these kind of throwaway items in these shoes. And it's one of my favorite pieces. And it was one of those that, even though it was in this very formal atmosphere, by dint of its ability as art, started to kind of like had you thinking immediately kind of beyond the walls. And that to me is where art gets especially effective. Now, kind of thinking about, these vessels, I think is the word I would continue to use. When you start to kind of go beyond that, obviously art has not always been experienced within walls. Art has been part of an exterior experience. It's been part of a public experience for a very long time. If you want to advance, this is a gargoyle on campus. This is actually at the Packer Church. So, relatively old by Lehigh standards, not old by gargoyle standards. But again, I think about these as representations of what visible public, what we would have considered public art or objects traditionally might have been, and that came weighted with a certain mythology or meaning that was most of the time outside of the individual who was looking at the piece of art or even the piece of architecture. They were used to tell a story. They were to tell a myth, to communicate to the people who might have been passing by or experiencing them. And I think one of the things now is we live in an era where we can turn that on its head a bit in these experiences and start to transform what are these kind of public pieces to allow people to see them in a whole new way, much as the work by Karen Olivier did. So if you want to advance, this is not a piece of art. This is from the same building. This is from the let me step back. I actually will say this is a piece of art because it's a beautiful piece of stone carving. These are replacements for the window frames at Packer Chapel that were damaged, had been significantly damaged from all the pollution from the steel plants over the 150 years of it being on campus. And the removal of it from its frame and seeing it kind of, part of the reason I was bringing this photograph up is that suddenly you start to look at it in a totally different way. You see these beautiful stone carved objects that are almost abstract and devoid and ripped from their meaning, so that now the person seeing them can engage in them in a much more kind of open way, in a much more imaginative, abstract way, which got to me was thinking, that's the power of a lot of modern and contemporary art, which is loosened from a lot of the stringencies of the past. And ultimately that led to, the thinking about what are successful spaces of encounter now, if you want to move ahead. And I think about spaces of art that are, I think, less formal. So even though, and I don't mean to imply they have to be outside, but this is a mural that's viewed from the High Line in New York. And to me, it's one of those you stumble upon it and it suddenly reframes your experience of the city. Not only does it obviously draw your eye out into the city beyond that park that you're inhabiting, but it also starts to reframe your experience of the city. It tells a different story about the city, and it actually embeds the piece of art literally in the experience of that urbanism. And to me, that is where you can see the power of art to create these types of spaces of encounter. And in a way that, you could literally be walking right by and never notice this. And then you could stand up and suddenly notice it. And to me, what you start to get is this combination of a external experience of art along with an internal experience of art, which is that, to me, that sweet spot where you're having an intense personal experience while engaged with a very intense public environment or experience. So if you want to go to the next. And in some way, and ultimately kind of going back to the architecture, to me, that's also how you manipulate some of the traditional media and aspects of architecture and arts, which is thinking about things like scale and form and material. This is this amazing installation that was at Washington Square I can't remember how many years ago, I think 3 or 4 years ago. I don't know who the artist is, but it essentially was this cage that fit in right under the arch. And then the way you walk through it was a cutout of 2 people that was extruded through that cage.
Mm.
So it was this open piece, and the arch, which, you know, I mean, talk about weighted with symbolism, a triumphal arch.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly you had this piece that was fitting into it and creating this whole new dynamic when you went through it, where it took this experience of going through this grand, traditional, grand public monument and suddenly personalizing it, making it more human in scale, creating reflectivity, taking materials to kind of totally transform how you occupy that. And of course, people love just walking through it. I spent probably 15 or 20 minutes just hanging out, watching how people went through it. There were the people that went around it, people that hung out in it. It was Instagram bait, as you might imagine. I probably posted something. But it created a lot of engagement, and you know, there was no specificity about it other than the fact that it was clearly, thoughtfully embedded at that particular moment of the city. So I think, you know, these are just different examples to me of how art and architecture and space, particularly public space, really, how we can start to kind of look at that mix and blend. And I think, you know, I'm thankful that Lena touched on the part that I'm missing because I'm an architect, which is actually people and the activity and that next level of engagement, which is, you know, performative arts or you know, dancing, those types of activities that then take this type of space to a whole other level. So. And then finally, you know, a project that I think is a great success, which is the installation in Farrington Square, which is the Story Garden, which is with Lehigh, working with the local students to tell stories and embed them is as part of literally this entrance to Lehigh that was telling stories from children on the south side. And to me, visually captures, I mean, it creates a great space. It grabs people's attention, and it tells this amazing story, which is one that situates Lehigh in the context of the South Side neighborhood. And even though it's a relatively modest installation, I mean, it was done by students. We worked with them, and you know, it was crafted on campus. I think it shows how effective these pieces of art can be, and the excitement. What you see here is the day they, I guess, officially unveiled it, and these are a lot of the students that worked on it. And the sheer excitement from seeing all these participants who had a hand in it and being engaged in it, and then, you know, and I still, you know, walking by, you know, you still catch people seeing it. It starts to become part of their experience, and to me, that's where we can see some true successes. So.
That's great. So
I think that's it. So
I think so, exactly. I think discussion. So I would love to, gosh, my head is just spinning with like so many different ideas and connections between both of you and what you just shared. But maybe what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can see one another a little bit better. And of course, if there are participants who would like to join our conversation, we invite you to use your microphone. You can also use the chat area, because speaking of opening creative spaces of encounter, we do not want you to feel closed from this creative space of encounter. So I don't know if Lena or Brent, if you have questions for one another to start us off with, but I'm just fascinated too by one thread that I think really joins something that you both talked about, is this idea of the combination of very thoughtful work, whether it's by artists or architects or urban planners or community organizers, but yet there's this element of happenstance or chance too, you know, the way people decide to interact in a space or not, the way that people come across a mural or a texture in a city. And so I'm not exactly sure what my question is in that, except, are there things that we could learn from that, either as a museum director, or in a university setting where should we be combining thoughtful spaces, but also chance encounters in new ways?
I'm going to jump right in, because finding the serendipitous to me is like one of the great challenges of design, because designers tend to be absolutely type A about everything being planned and so forth. So allowing for that lack of control is a difficult thing to preordain. And I would say, to me, and this is where a university is a great setting for it, and I think Lena showed it a little bit, like the dance troupe taking over the plaza at Alumni Memorial Building. To me, I think to get to some of these it's a constant testing, right? And so an idea that trying things out and seeing what works, understanding there may be different levels of success or failure, and even the failure may tell you something, and allowing the university itself to be not just again, getting away from the idea of the container or vessel where something's been calcified and kind of set in there, and instead saying the university itself is a live palette. Let's start using it, and let's start remembering, like, it's every place at the university should be a place of engagement, of test, of thought, and let's try that out. Knowing that there'll be some things that may be amazing successes, and there may be other things that the president of the university is calling us the next day saying, what were you thinking, right? So
yeah, no, absolutely. And Lena, any thoughts on that too, and your experience working with artists and with different communities? Kind of how do you find this balance between very thoughtful, pre-planned activities and chance or spontaneity?
Well, I think that's perfect what Bryn is saying. I'm sorry, my internet was doing bizarre things, but I think I'm here.
Speaking of spontaneity, yep.
Yes, exactly, things you can't control. We take certain paths through space, and universities map out some of those paths, often for safety, so we don't get run over, but also there are certain ways of moving that are choreographed. And then as human beings, we don't follow the rules, and different people come into the space and we take different paths. And I think that's what opens up these really interesting encounters, because we can't plan for what will unfold, and we don't know when somebody will touch something, and what's kind of ricocheting through the body, and will somebody climb up on something inevitably, or who do we encounter in the space, and what conversation might happen? Will we fall in love with somebody? Will we just say, oh, I've never seen someone somehow that looks like you? Or all of those things can happen. And what intrigues me once we get out of our cages and back on campus, and as I get to know the campus, is thinking again, those very interesting borders between the campus and the rest of the community, and what can happen at those edges, and how to keep making that porosity more and more open and more welcoming. So I think all of the chance is where the really interesting stuff will happen, and maybe we create the space, but we don't actually create what happens. So that's the sort of releasing and opening to see what emerges.
That's a really good point. And, this idea of being porous, of blurring the boundaries between spaces to allow for different types of people and communities to interact with one another. Museums often do not have such a very good history of being good neighbors, or even if it was done with what they thought was good intent, they would say, well, let's go do something for the community rather than with a community, or even part of being a community. But even over 100 years ago, there was a great museum educator and curator, John Cotton Dana, who worked at the Newark Museum. And he said, museums should really be more like a great department store. Bamberger's had just opened in downtown Newark, and he was very critical of museums that had moved their locations into distant, beautiful parks like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that were away from people, that were these rarefied spaces. So maybe it's something for us to think about as we all re-emerge into our physical lives, which is to question, like, what is our space? Where are we? How can we transcend our physical spaces? How can we interrogate some of those spaces?
I think you touch on, I mean, I was kind of thinking more about how do we get people to engage kind of across the broad campus, but one of the challenges, not just for art museums or performance spaces, is to understand that a lot of the traditional forms of architecture that we use for these spaces are exclusionary, even if not intended to be, from their history and from the messaging and from the propriety that they tend to instill. There is that question of, oh, I probably don't belong. This isn't the right place for me to go in. So and that's a challenge. I would say that's a challenge for a university like Lehigh, which has a very traditional, a campus which is incredibly beautiful, but also one that is of a certain style that implies a certain type of collegiate experience and tradition. And how do you negotiate those to ensure that there is a comfort among everybody in terms of engaging, occupying, coming into those spaces? I mean, we talked in preparation for this meeting about the whole question of, like, why are museums quiet, right? I mean,
yeah.
And it kind of gets to the department store idea. People should be going in, and there should be dialogue and discourse and kind of, vigorous debate. You could have people coming in and saying, I don't get it, there's 3 colors, that's not painting, and let it roll.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting topic to think about, how you both kind of engage broad, how do you engage externally, but then also how do you create the conditions by which the community and others, even people within the Lehigh community, feel comfortable in different buildings and feel like they can go in and say, we're going to have our dance troupe is going to set up right here, and we're going to do this.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about changing one's state of mind too, which is kind of easier said than done. We're also well trained to behave well in institutions or to follow tradition. I mean, these are words that loom large in universities and in museums. And Lena, I know you're immersed in this work too as director of the Center for Global Citizenship Education. And I know that you are often responding to this question of, what does it take to be a global citizen? What kinds of skills and attitudes and knowledge? And so I wonder, this is not a pre-prepared question, so you can answer this however way you'd like, but what are some things that we could all be doing differently, maybe in terms of how we interact with one another in our spaces, or physically or socially, maybe through the lens of global citizenship, that we should think about?
Well, what we're trying to do in this new center is actually to flip that and say, how can we use art to precisely interact with each other in different ways? But we're trying to create something really that promotes social change and global citizenship education through the arts, and to create this space of radical hospitality where we're open to all genres, all sorts of contributors. So not just the famous and the glorious, but regular folks, as people who want to try something out and offer it up, whether these are our international partners or students, and to promote this dialogue, and through any language as well as the other thing we're promoting. So not in translation, you do not have to assimilate to the majority. So we're trying to just make a space for everyone to feel welcome and to come and experience the difference, and keep the difference centered as opposed to polish it and frame it and control it. So it is a sense of kind of creating, again, an intimate space, but then blowing up what can happen in that. So always these odd kind of transitional. And I always like the image kind of the Lion, Witch, in the Wardrobe, where you go into the little box and then, oh, something you didn't expect. So I think of a museum sort of like that. It's not necessarily a closed space if what happens on the other side of the door blows your mind and expands the universe. So that's sort of how I like to think about that.
Fabulous. I love that phrase of radical hospitality and what does that mean and being welcoming. I see that Lena Weissman has raised her hand. Lena, do you want to take the microphone or use the chat area? Would love to have your thoughts and questions.
I had a question about how you're approaching the impacts of COVID-19 and the way that it's impacted people to engage with their physical spaces, both during the pandemic and then as we look to the fall, like how people are going to be re-engaging with our campus environment and the art and culture that normally comes with that engagement, especially in the fall semester.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I know Brent was completely immersed in responding to this from moment one, you know, heading up committees but yeah, this idea of re-emergence. Any thoughts on that, either Brent or Lena? Feel free to take the mic.
So I think there's some advantages potentially, which is there's an opportunity to rethink how people engage, and I think that is one piece that I hope people can take advantage of. I think there'll be certainly an urge to kind of just go back to where we were, but there may be some fertile ground now for rethinking how we do things, how we engage, how do we use the arts on campus. We've had to start thinking about things like, oh, the dance troupe used the parking circle at Alumni Memorial. Well, that was really great. So why don't we have dance performances out in front of Alumni Hall, right? So there are things I think we can glean from that. I do think you touch on something else though, which is, and there may be a bit of inherent tension depending on people's comfort, but I think there will be a rabid desire to return to that experience, that kind of feeling of being engaged. I think, I know personally, I know talking with my staff, I know talking with some other students, just this idea of like, I want to get there. I want to start that. I want that fullness of experience that you get being on a campus and in the city. And, you know, how do we harness that energy and take advantage of that and use that as a way to kind of drive these points of connection, and also use it as a point for people to start to reconnect with each other, right? I mean, we've been isolated, we've been masked, we've had all kinds of you know, additive elements that have kept us kind of all separated, and you know, here we are on a screen kind of talking to each other. So I'm optimistic about it, and I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I think a lot of it will be to kind of maintain some of the ingenuity that we've had to employ, but in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, you know, when you're mentioning like how people will feel comfortable going forward, that's a phrase I've been thinking about a lot. And certainly at the art galleries, we're thinking about programs for the fall where people could engage in many different ways, you know, individually or indoors or outdoors, or touching things or not touching things. And for me too, it's kind of caused me to wonder about my practices in the past. Like I always considered myself someone who really focused on access and making sure people's barriers were removed who needed access. But it causes me to question, like maybe people weren't comfortable in ways that I hadn't thought about before. So that is something that I'm sure we'll be revisiting at the art galleries. And I know Lena is transitioning because of some Wi-Fi issues there, maybe with the internet. But speaking of emerging,
Sorry about that.
No, this is the life that we lead. Absolutely. Oh, super. Well, any other questions or thoughts though from others that are here in our digital space of encounter this evening? Feel free if you'd like to take the microphone, or if you'd like to pose a question or a thought in the chat area, you're most welcome to. We've got about 5 minutes or so left. Sorry, I know that's always a quick way to bring things to a halt, probably is when maybe everyone is immersed in thinking about different ideas and everyone's having very different experiences. Or other questions?
Oh, there's
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Nancy. A pleasure to have you with us, a fellow museum educator who's joined us. Thank you so much, Nancy. Fabulous. Well, I think it's going to be certainly a new moment for us to be rethinking what do these creative spaces of encounter look like when we reemerge into the world. And I for one am looking forward to getting to see all of you in person at some point in the near future. Maybe unless there are any concluding thoughts or ideas, I do want to make sure everyone knows that we welcome you at the art galleries at Lehigh. We're open, albeit on a modified COVID schedule at the moment, Tuesdays through Fridays, 11 to 5. But of course, are just delighted that you've joined us here for this online program, in this digital space. And I want to thank Brent Stringfellow, Associate Vice President for Facilities and University Architect, Angelina Rodriguez, Director of the Center for Global Citizenship Education through the Arts and Professor of Practice in the College of Education, for joining me on this this informal dialogue about a lot of ideas that I'm going to be thinking about for quite a while. So, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Lena and Brent. We're just delighted that you could join us this evening.
Thank you. This was fun. I would love to do this walking around the campus and starting to talk about different spaces. We should plan to do that in the fall.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
We will absolutely do that. That sounds great to me. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope everyone has a good rest of their evening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.